On a frozen winter evening in 39 AD, an eerie stillness gripped the heart of the empire. It wasn't the kind of quiet that comes with snowfall or the peaceful end of day. This was the silence of dread, the kind that settles over households when everyone knows something unspeakable is about to unfold. Across the city, noble families held their breath, wondering if tonight would be the night their daughter's name was called. If you were a young girl of 14, already dressed for bed, and imagining the world beyond your window was safe, you had no idea how quickly that illusion could shatter. The sound of armored boots on cobblestone would be the first warning, the rhythmic clang of metal against stone, growing louder with each passing second, until it stopped directly outside your door. You had been raised to believe that imperial attention was an honor, a mark of distinction that elevated your family's status. But no one ever told you it could arrive without invitation, without ceremony, without mercy. No one prepared you for the sight of palace guards crossing your threshold as if your home had already ceased to be yours. And certainly no one explained the meaning of the red, covered lantern they carried, the one they would set down at your entrance, like a brand marking livestock for slaughter. Within moments, you would hear your mother's voice, soft and trembling, speaking your name as though the gods themselves might be listening and waiting to pass judgment. Your father would try to smile, to offer some gesture of reassurance, but the expression would crumble before it ever reached his eyes. And in those terrible moments, you would come to understand what every patrician family whispers about in the darkest hours. The palace doesn't request the presence of daughters, it seizes them. And if you believe this is where the nightmare begins for a girl named Flavia, you are mistaken. What waits for her inside the imperial residence will make this moment seem almost kind by comparison. This is not speculation or legend embellished over centuries. This was the night a place known as the Garden of Venus opened its doors. A ritual so profoundly disturbing that the empire spent generations attempting to erase every record of its existence. If you find yourself drawn to the darker corridors of history, the stories that civilizations would rather forget, then subscribe to my channel and leave a like. And when you reach the moment that troubles you most deeply, tell me where you're watching from. Let's begin. The girl who will be the first to learn these truths is Flavia. Hold her name in your mind, because everything you're about to discover was shaped by the formation of the man who will soon determine her fate. To comprehend how a human being can decay from within and emerge as something capable of devouring an entire civilization, you must travel back to the origin, back to the bloodline that produced him and the darkness that molded him long before the empire learned to fear what he would become. The emperor, who would later be known as Caligula, did not spring fully formed from madness. He entered the world wrapped in glory, the son of Germanicus, the golden general of Rome, a man whose mere presence could silence a legion in mid-march and ignite the loyalty of an entire city. By every measure, the boy should have inherited honor, courage, and nobility. Instead, something far more corrosive began to seep into the foundation of his character. His early years were not spent in tranquil gardens or the refined halls of tutors and philosophers. They unfolded at the brutal edge of the empire, in military encampments saturated with sweat, iron, and the metallic taste of coming war. He learned to walk between rows of battle-hardened soldiers, the ground trembling beneath the synchronized thunder of hobnailed sandals. The legionaries adored seeing their commander's son dressed in miniature armor, and they gave him an affectionate nickname, Little Boot. It was a term of endearment then, though it would later attach itself to a legacy drenched in terror. But even in those early days, something inside him began to warp. That frontier existence taught him his first terrible lesson. Power is not something you inherit and hold passively. Power is something you seize with both hands, and once you possess it, you never apologize for how you wield it. It was the first fracture in the child's spirit, and those fractures were about to deepen into chasms. The blow that shattered what remained of his innocence came with the mysterious death of his father. Overnight, the cherished child became a target. He watched, powerless, as his mother and brothers were exiled, imprisoned, and eventually executed one by one. There was no invading army, no barbarian horde, just the cold, deliberate will of Emperor Tiberius. And then came the island of Capri, the place where the Roman people imagined Tiberius lived out his retirement in peaceful contemplation. But behind those palace walls, something monstrous was fermenting, and the twisted education the boy received there would be paid for by Flavia in ways she could never anticipate. Barely past adolescence, he was forced to live alongside the man who had annihilated his family. Capri was not a sanctuary. It was a gilded tomb, sealed tight with paranoia and suspicion. For 6 suffocating years, he survived under the gaze of an emperor who trusted no one and killed on impulse. There he learned a rule even darker than the first. To survive, you must smile at the man whose destruction you dream of nightly. He concealed every tear, suppressed every tremor of rage, and bowed before the murderer of his blood. And while he maintained the appearance of obedience, the fractures in his mind widened, spreading until something cold and resentful slipped through the cracks and took root. So when Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, and the Senate elevated him to the throne at the age of 24, the city erupted in jubilation. A new beginning, a new prince. The son of the beloved general had arrived to cleanse the corruption. And for a brief moment, he did exactly that. He released prisoners, destroyed the records kept by Tiberius's network of informants, reduced hated taxes, and poured wealth into the streets through games, spectacles, and public feasts. The people believed they had been delivered from darkness, but the man who would one day reach for Flavia had not yet fully awakened. His darkness was only beginning to stretch its wings, but deliverance was only a mask concealing something far worse. Near the end of that first year, an illness struck him with such violence that he hovered on the edge of death for days. And when he finally rose from that bed, something vital had not returned with him. The boy who learned on Capri to hide his hatred no longer needed to hide anything at all. Standing atop the Palatine Hill, gazing down at a city that worshipped him as a savior, he finally understood a terrible truth. When you reach the summit of absolute power, there are no gods remaining above you, only victims below. The cheers of the crowds, the trembling deference of the Senate, none of it humbled him. Instead, his sanity began to peel away like rotting skin, and beneath it emerged the creature that Capri had carved from a traumatized child. Generosity twisted into compulsion, justice curdled into cruelty, and within the labyrinth of his thoughts, an idea began to crystallize. Women of noble birth were not citizens, not daughters, not human beings with agency. They were instruments to be used. And the first instrument he would test was waiting on a night that Flavia did not yet know would destroy her life forever. This transformation didn't descend on the city like a sudden storm. It crept through the empire like a plague, slow and quiet and untraceable. A poison that seeped beneath marble floors and into patrician households until it reached the families who believed themselves most secure. And somewhere across the city, Flavia's family heard the knock that no household dared answer, but no one was permitted to refuse. It began with a visitation. The emperor's messengers did not carry weapons that day. They carried scrolls sealed with imperial purple, a color that meant either elevation or extinction. Inside those scrolls was a demand no parent could deny. Send your daughter, not just any daughter, the most beautiful, the most pure, the most politically useful. Families called it an honor when they spoke of it in public. They knew in private it was a death sentence wrapped in silk and perfume. To refuse the emperor was treason punishable by the annihilation of your entire line. To obey him was to deliver your child directly into the jaws of the beast. The girls were escorted to a secluded wing of the palace, a place the emperor named with deliberate irony, the Garden of Venus. When Flavia stepped across that threshold, she still believed she retained some measure of control over her fate. She would lose that belief before the sun rose again. At first glance, the place appeared to be paradise itself. Pink marble walls, beds draped in fabrics softer than anything she had ever touched, exotic fragrances drifting through the air, and servants who moved like ghosts, anticipating every need before it was spoken. The daughters of noble families entered, believing they had been selected for sacred ceremonial duties. But slowly, agonizingly, the truth revealed itself. Paradise was merely decoration. The prison was everything that lay beneath. And the true purpose of this place, the horror it concealed behind beauty, was still waiting in the shadows to make itself known. And the worst part was this. This was only the beginning. Because once Flavia's summons arrived, she would learn that the Garden of Venus did not break girls quickly and mercifully. It broke them slowly enough for them to understand every step of their unraveling. The jewels they were required to wear were not adornments. They were chains, heavy gold pressed cold against their skin, branding each girl as property of the state. The transparent silks were even worse, garments designed not to cover them but to expose them, to remind them constantly that their bodies no longer belonged to themselves. Their names were the first things the emperor erased. Real names were dangerous because real names carried identity. So he replaced them with numbers, with mockeries, with humiliating nicknames he whispered himself. With every stripped layer of identity, the Garden of Venus tightened its grip. But the true weapon of this system wasn't jewelry or fabric, or even overt violence. It was waiting. A form of torture that drew no blood and left no visible scars, yet hollowed them out from the inside. They never knew when the summons would arrive. It could be tonight, it could be weeks away, and every moment in between became an execution by anticipation. The echo of Praetorian sandals in the corridor made their hearts rupture with terror. Breathing became labor. Sleep became impossible. By the time the emperor ever laid hands on them, the psychological destruction was already complete. They were prey that had been softened for the killing. And when the summons finally came, it did not lead them to a private chamber, but to the emperor's nightly theater, the banquet halls. The young women were paraded before the elite of Rome like exotic animals on display. Not guests, but living decorations. He walked among them with the arrogance of a butcher selecting cuts of meat. He commented loudly on their bodies, mocking, praising, ranking them, stripping away the last fragments of dignity they clung to. But the real cruelty was not his voice. It was the silence of the men who should have protected them. Fathers, uncles, betrothed partners, all seated at tables of honor, forced to nod and smile at the emperor's obscenities. Their expressions stretched so tight they looked carved from stone. Any flicker of discomfort, any tremor of disgust could condemn them or the girl to immediate execution. That silence was its own form of murder, and then came the final act, not chaos or frenzy, but ritual as rehearsed as theater. Soft music played to smother any sounds of distress. Selected spectators watched in forced admiration, and unspoken rules governed every movement the victim was required to perform. This was not about pleasure for him. This was choreography, performance, a demonstration that he owned not just bodies but souls. And Flavia, standing beneath torchlight, realized with sickening clarity that the emperor no longer saw her as human. He saw her as a stage where he rehearsed his capacity for cruelty. Consider Flavia, daughter of a respected consul, When she crossed into the Garden of Venus for the first time, she still believed she might serve in ceremonies or walk in processions beside the emperor. For the first several days, he showered her with gifts, with attentiveness, even with a counterfeit gentleness that disarmed her completely. It softened her defenses. It set the trap perfectly. And when it finally snapped shut, when the illusion shattered and the truth bared its teeth, Flavia understood the one rule that governed existence within those walls. You cannot resist a man who believes himself to be a god. He wielded cruelty with the precision of a master craftsman. He alternated brutality with feigned affection, brutalizing a girl one night and weeping in her lap the next as he offered jewels worth the value of entire estates. This calculated emotional whiplash rewired the mind. Victims could no longer see him clearly. Hope and terror blended together. Comfort and violence fused into a single experience. The one who broke them became the only one who could soothe them. It was a dependency engineered with deliberate intent, making escape not just difficult, but psychologically impossible. But he was not finished. Next, he destroyed any possibility of solidarity among the victims. Flavia tried to disappear into the crowd, to become invisible among the others. But in the Garden of Venus, invisibility could lead to execution just as swiftly as being noticed. He ranked the girls openly, announcing who pleased him most, who disappointed him, who would receive favor, and who would face punishment. He turned them against one another until they competed desperately for crumbs of safety, each girl viewing the others not as companions in suffering, but as obstacles to survival. Unity died in that environment. And once unity died, the emperor owned everything that remained. And when he tired of one of them, he did not grant her freedom. He sold her. Clandestine auctions were held within the palace walls, offering broken young women to senators and military commanders, the same men who governed the empire by daylight. He forced them to participate, staining their hands with the same filth that coated his own. Shared guilt became the strongest leash imaginable, and now the empire's elite were chained to him by their complicity and their silence. But the degradation did not stop there. Families were commanded to express gratitude. Some fathers were forced to host celebratory feasts after their daughters had been violated. They raised cups and toasted their child's supposed honor while swallowing their horror like poison. Within the palace, gratitude became another word for despair. And through all of this, surveillance tightened like a noose around every throat. No corner offered safety. Guards, slaves, informants, eyes everywhere watching and reporting. Even a single muffled cry in the night could be reported as rebellion. Inside the Garden of Venus, layer after layer of humanity was scraped away methodically until nothing remained but flesh, fear, and the echo of footsteps approaching in the darkness. By the years 40 and 41 AD, the atmosphere within the palace had become so toxic it could suffocate anyone who breathed it. The girls who had once arrived with bright eyes and soft voices were now skeletal phantoms drifting through corridors like ghosts already dead. Many stopped speaking entirely. Some stopped responding to any external stimulus. Their minds retreated inward, hiding in the last place he could not reach. Physicians noted symptoms of dissociation, souls detaching from bodies simply to survive another day. But the truth the court tried hardest to conceal was far darker than madness. The suicides had begun, and once they started, they did not stop. Some girls broke under the weight, others shattered completely. Flavia found herself caught somewhere between those extremes, too frightened to choose death, too broken to call what she endured living. Whispers among the servants spoke of 6 confirmed suicides, but everyone knew the truth. 6 was merely the number the palace had failed to hide successfully. The real count lay buried beneath marble floors and imperial silence, and Flavia began to wonder if surviving was actually the cruelest outcome of all. Death, once the thing they had feared most, became the only horizon that offered relief, a final act of sovereign freedom in a world where they owned nothing else, not even their own names. Some girls slit their veins with shards of shattered pottery. Some tore strips of silk from their luxurious garments and fashioned nooses from them. Others simply climbed to the balconies and stepped off, letting gravity deliver the mercy their emperor never would. For these young women, the cold embrace of death became kinder than his touch. But the emperor was not satisfied with the suffering he had already inflicted. In his delusion of divinity, he devised a new form of torment, one so perverse it attacked the victims through the people they loved most. He permitted parents to visit their daughters, not to rescue them, not to offer comfort, but to witness their suffering firsthand. The girls were painted, perfumed, dressed in elaborate silks designed to conceal their bruises. They were forced to smile, forced to perform, forced to lie, their horror buried beneath cosmetics and trembling lips. And the parents, watched constantly by armed centurions, were required to pretend this was a joyous occasion. If a mother's voice cracked with emotion, she could be executed on the spot. If a daughter allowed her mask to slip for even a moment, her entire family paid the price. Everyone was trapped in a grotesque performance, forced to swallow their agony, while the architect of their suffering watched with satisfaction. But then he made the single mistake that every tyrant eventually makes. He humiliated the men who carried the swords. Destroying women was no longer sufficient. He needed to emasculate the very pillars of imperial power. He dragged senators to watch their wives be violated. He mocked commanders of the Praetorian Guard, stripping them of dignity in front of their own soldiers. He forced honored veterans to utter vulgar passwords deliberately designed to degrade them. And among those soldiers was a man whose loyalty had once been absolute. Cassius Chaerea, a hardened veteran who had served under Germanicus himself. The emperor's mockery of him was relentless and public. He believed himself untouchable, convinced that no blade would ever dare rise against him. He was catastrophically wrong. The hatred festering in Korea and the other conspirators mutated into something that transcended politics. It became a matter of survival. The emperor, once a potentially useful ruler, had become a malignant tumor consuming the Roman state from within. And on January 24th, 41 AD, the accumulated tension finally exploded. During the Palatine Games, he left through a private underground corridor, the Cryptoporticus, intending to take a bath. He entered that dim stone passageway, believing himself immortal. He would not leave it alive. Chaerea and his fellow conspirators blocked the path ahead. There was no dramatic speech, no formal trial, no final warning. Only steel. The first strike, a blade thrust into his neck, shattered his larynx, silencing the man who had demanded worship as a living god. His cries choked in a flood of his own blood. Then came the frenzy of violence. More than 30 stab wounds tore into his body. The self-proclaimed Jupiter of Rome collapsed to the ground, writhing, pleading, dying like the terrified mortal he truly was. His life ended in a spreading pool of blood, humiliation etched across his contorted face. But the nightmare was far from over. Just meters away, sealed inside the Garden of Venus, the young women heard the chaos erupting. The screams, the clash of metal, the thunder of rushing feet. They huddled in corners, shaking, unable to comprehend whether this was salvation or simply another form of doom approaching. Then came silence. Not the heavy silence of oppression they had learned to endure, but an empty, unfamiliar silence of a world where the monster had suddenly ceased to exist. Yet none of them dared move, because after years imprisoned in that palace, they understood one thing with horrifying clarity. When something ends in Rome, something worse often rises to take its place, and they were right to fear what came next. The emperor's death did not bring the golden dawn they might have hoped for. It opened a void. His Germanic bodyguards, discovering their master dead, erupted in blind fury. The palace, transformed into a slaughterhouse within minutes. They cut down servants, officials, anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path in those chaotic moments. For the young women trapped inside, the Garden of Venus became a death trap with no clear escape. Some fled barefoot through corridors littered with broken glass and bodies. Others, paralyzed by years of conditioning and terror, barricaded themselves in their chambers, gripping each other in the darkness, waiting to discover whether the next hand on their door would kill them or free them. Hours later, when the blood haze finally began to clear, an unlikely figure emerged from hiding. Claudius, the dead emperor's trembling uncle, was dragged from behind a curtain and thrust onto the imperial throne by soldiers who needed someone, anyone, to restore order. Claudius, ever the survivor, faced an impossible truth. If Rome learned what had truly happened inside the Garden of Venus, if the full scope of the system became public knowledge, the complicity, the participation of noble families, the silent consent of the Senate, the empire itself might fracture beyond repair. So he made a decision darker than silence and far more convenient for everyone in power. For the survivors of the Garden of Venus, Rome's solution was not justice. It was payment. A cold transaction designed to suffocate the truth before it could draw a single breath. The palace returned the young women to their families draped in gold, clothed in expensive imported fabrics, and carrying dowries large enough to silence an entire city. But every coin carried the same unspoken command. Forget what happened within those walls. Forget who did it. Forget the daughters Rome fed to a god who was never divine at all. No trials were convened. No accomplices were punished. No records were kept. Rome simply folded the truth into shadows and buried it under layers of official silence. The girls returned to their family estates, but the people who came home were not the ones who had left. They were shells, walking corpses, bodies that still drew breath but souls that had died on the Palatine Hill and were never permitted to return. In the cruel calculus of Roman society, a noble woman's worth lived and died with her chastity. And though these girls were victims, children crushed beneath a system they could never resist, the stain followed them like a curse they could not wash away. Family honor was ranked above truth, above compassion, above their very lives. Most of them never married. Most never truly lived again. They were hidden away inside distant rooms in remote wings of their family estates, kept from view like shameful relics, seen only by the servants who left food outside their doors. Their trauma unfolded in agonizing, predictable patterns. A hand placed on their shoulder triggered panic. A sudden noise made them collapse in fear. Sleep, when it came at all, brought nightmares so vivid they woke screaming night after night after night. Physical captivity had ended, but the prison constructed inside their minds had no guards to kill, no emperor to overthrow, no key that could unlock them. For them, freedom was not a victory. It was a sentence, a lifelong exile inside their own bodies with no possibility of parole. Rome looked away. Rome always looked away. It was easier to blame the women than to confront the empire's own corruption. Easier to bury a crime than to examine the rotting foundation of the civilization that had permitted it. Because the truth about his reign was never really about one man's madness. It was about the system that built him, fed him, protected him, and allowed the Garden of Venus to exist in the first place. Later, historians would argue endlessly over exact details, whether ancient writers embellished certain elements, whether rival dynasties magnified his cruelty for political purposes. But the convergence of multiple sources tells us one thing without question. A machine of abuse existed. A machine specifically constructed to satisfy one man's darkest impulses. And Rome allowed that machine to operate in silence. This was not an isolated horror. an aberration in an otherwise noble system. It was a fundamental flaw in the empire's very architecture. Rome had concentrated legislative, judicial, military, and even divine power into the hands of a single individual. No checks, no limits, no escape route if the wrong man ascended to the throne. His reign proved how thin the line truly is between civilization and savagery, between order and chaos, between ruler and monster. And that line was drawn not on marble or parchment, but on the bodies of nameless girls who perished in the Garden of Venus. Rome built wonders that survived millennia: arenas, aqueducts, roads, legal codes that influenced jurisprudence for centuries. But it failed at the simplest duty any society owes its people: to protect the most vulnerable from the predators who occupy positions of ultimate power. The story of these women is not merely a historical tragedy to be studied and filed away. It is a warning that echoes across time itself. A nation may reach the absolute summit of power, may command legions and conquer continents, but if it sacrifices human dignity in the process, its legacy will be written not in glory but in shame. History is often shaped by the victors, recorded by those who survive and thrive. But shadows have a way of enduring. The erased names, the unwritten letters, the tears dried into silk pillows long turned to dust. They remain in the margins that empires tried to burn away. And now they belong to us, to every generation that comes after. We, centuries removed from these events, must decide whether to look directly at those shadows or to repeat the patterns they reveal. Because evil does not always announce itself with swords drawn and fires burning. Sometimes evil wears a crown and speaks in cultured tones. Sometimes evil hides behind institutional silence and collective complicity. And sometimes evil thrives simply because too many people with power choose not to be outraged, choose not to act, choose not to remember. If this story has unsettled you, let it settle deep. If it has angered you, carry that anger forward. And if it has made you think carefully about the cost of unchecked authority and the price paid by those with no power to resist, then the voices Rome tried to erase have finally, after 2,000 years, been heard.